Why do so many players seem to crumble at Manchester United? Well, there's a few different reasons, and in this video we are separating them into 3 different categories. First up comes the expectations of playing for Manchester United. Now, I think there's only perhaps Real Madrid, Barcelona where it compares, and this is often one of the main reasons for players failing. It is of course not helped by the inflated fees that United pay for players, which almost immediately puts a target on their back, but the media attention is incredible compared to other English clubs. You see other clubs are able to almost introduce players a bit more slowly, or if they are failing, there's not as much attention. At United it is different. You can have a Jadon Sancho who doesn't get off the mark and there's immediately pressure, attention, expectations to perform soon. At other clubs, they are afforded more time. They're afforded more time to adapt. You see Manchester City and they've got a very good base of players, but if someone starts slowly, if they're not playing as much, they don't get as much attention and then they seem to grow into their role. You think of Cancelo, you think of Jack Grealish and more. These players have often been able to slowly adapt into the team, slowly adapt into the way of play. That's not really afforded at United as much. You think of players like Memphis Depay, who wasn't terrible when he went to Manchester United, but he was nowhere near good enough to the expectations set upon him, and that partly led to him being considered a flop, a failing. And then there's also the fans who have big expectations for players who have almost been signed to be the final piece of the puzzle. But the problem is at Manchester United is it always seems to be the final piece of the puzzle, but it never is. Secondly comes the club situation. Now, I don't need to tell you that Manchester United have not been a well-run club in the past decade, and that filters through to the new signings, to the existing players. The club dynamic has been poor, changing managers, changing philosophies, and like I mentioned beforehand, these players, even superstar players, often need to adapt into a new system. But the problem is that has always been changing at United, and hopefully that changes for the good under Ineos, but we can't deny that that has impacted a lot of players. And at the same time, the recruitment has been poor. Some of these players have often been recruited wrongly. You see Angel Di Maria playing wing-back for Louis van Gaal, playing striker for Louis van Gaal. There was no position for perhaps one of the most creative players in the game at the time. You think of Jadon Sancho, like I've said beforehand, there was no plan. It didn't seem like United had a plan for him. And ultimately, those club issues mean that there's never really been stability at Old Trafford. And no matter who you are, the best player in the world, the worst player in the world, you often need stability to be a real success. And that has been absent from Manchester United in the past decade. But lastly, I think we've also just got to consider the reality of a lot of these signings. And a lot of them, despite having unrealistic expectations, despite the situation of the club, a lot of these players just weren't good enough. Whether that be signing a player too young, too raw, or signing someone who you think has experience but is clearly past their prime, United have done it too often. And whilst we can all accept that the things that I've mentioned before have definitely contributed to these players being considered flops, being considered failures, a lot of it does come down to the recruitment and Manchester United just simply not signing good enough players. Ineos, of course, will be aware of these different factors and why players fail at the club. And whilst they can't do too much about the expectations placed on a Manchester United player, they certainly can improve the club situation so that players can enter the club and not be expected to be a saviour. And they can also improve that recruitment so in reality, when we look back on players, we don't realise that they simply weren't good enough in the first place.